Welcome everyone, Mike Fave here. Today I have an interesting video to share with you guys. I'm going to go through the recent podcast between Dave Asprey and Thomas DeLauer, where Dave discusses some of the new concepts that he has recently changed his mind on. And interestingly enough, many of these concepts are basically pillars of the bioenergetic perspective that Dave seems to some extent to, he does make a nod to Raid Pete, but it seems to some extent it's like almost word for word or direct perspectives taken from the bioenergetic community and from Dr. Pete's work. And this video I think is pretty important because what you're seeing now is a lot of these low carb gurus and authority figures, Dave Asprey, Dr. Mercola, Thomas DeLauer, you saw Paul Saladino, make this transition from a low carbohydrate diet to a higher carbohydrate diet and then start to incorporate bioenergetic principles. These guys have run the low carb approach. They've developed problems along the way, and then they essentially realized that, okay, maybe it's not the carbs, maybe there's something else. This was a similar process that I had gone through myself after trying different diets, and this is something I see with many clients as well. So I don't actually fault these guys for saying, hey, look, I tried the low carb stuff and I started to add in carbs and I solved a lot of problems that were there, because it definitely happens. But I think it's important when you start to adopt a new perspective that you're pretty transparent about where this perspective is coming from. Give credit to the people who have propositioned or put out these ideas beforehand, and then, kind of discuss these things in an open way and be like, hey, I had X, Y, and Z problem when I was doing carbs here, and then these were the things that changed. So here we're going to start with a conversation on sugar, and more specifically fructose.
Sugar.
What's your favorite sugar?
Ooh, Pixie Sticks. No.
You snort those too?
Yeah, heck yeah. If I had to pick one, I'd probably say, piss people off and say fructose.
Why would you actually make that your favorite? Just because you're a troll?
Okay. No, predominantly because I like fruit, but not because the fact that, I'm getting 100% fructose when I bite into an apple. Personally, I like a small amount of fructose. It doesn't spike my insulin.
Of course it doesn't. Fructose doesn't do that. It just spikes your liver fat. Liver fat, you can't see it, so it's okay.
Yeah, but if I'm going to be consuming a rampant amount of it and I'm also in a major surplus, then it could be an issue. But for me, I'm active. I'm metabolically healthy. I keep a close eye on my DEXA and my visceral fat, and I'm not having an issue with a small amount of fructose. But I'm consuming maybe 30 grams per day.
That's funny. That's the upper limit on my recommendations from the Bulletproof Diet is don't do more than that.
The first thing I want to point out is there's a couple implications or presuppositions that DeLauer and Asprey point out here. So one, Thomas DeLauer says, I can have fructose because I'm metabolically healthy, I'm physically fit, I'm active, and then I have a low body fat percentage. I have many clients that I work with who have a decent amount of fruit within their diet, whole fruit, frozen fruit, and then they also have some fruit juice in their diet, and they actually lose weight, improve their body composition, and they don't necessarily get a fatty liver. Implementing carbohydrates is part of the process of becoming metabolically healthy, as well as removing problematic components in the diet, like the polyunsaturated fatty acids, like dialing in what's going on with the gut microbiome, etc. So this idea that we need to be metabolically healthy first, I think this is a problematic idea, and I don't think this is reality. And I also don't think this is borne out in the research, because a lot of the metabolic dysfunction that we see inside the research is characterized by excessive fatty acid oxidation. So this perspective that we need to burn more fats first and then we can burn carbs is actually quite problematic and tenuous, because in reality, the more fats that you're burning, the less you will be able to burn carbs. And I discussed this inside my Mike Fave Science channel on the Randall Cycle video series. There's 2 videos there going through what happens in the mitochondria when you're burning carbs versus you're burning fats, and how they inhibit each other's oxidation or burning. Now, the next piece here that Dave slips in really quick is that if you have fructose, it's just going to increase your liver fat. This is actually not necessarily true, especially from whole fruit sources and frozen fruit, dried fruit, etc. Even in the papers where they give people pure fructose, what you see is the conversion to liver fat, I think, is like less than 1%. Now, fructose can alter the metabolism of the fatty acids inside the body, but to just say that, oh, it's just going to increase your liver fat, across the board, I think is a pretty tenuous statement as well. And both Jay and I have covered this on the Energy Balance podcast in the Fatty Liver series, so you can go and check that out. And then I also talk about what goes on at the liver inside the podcast I recently did with Dr. Paul Saladino. This is going to be an interesting clip where we learn how much carbs Dave Asprey is eating at this point. And I think it's going to be pretty surprising for a lot of people, considering what his previous perspective was on carbohydrates, especially if anybody ever tried the Bulletproof diet.
Going back at the very beginning of this, I would have said carbs universally make you fat because my entire life they have. Any carbs, I would get fat. And it was a problem. I fixed my metabolism and I can eat 300 grams of carbs a day. I quite often do. And I'm 6.5% body fat and I don't put weight on. And that's because of a functioning metabolism, not because carbs make you fat. If you have a dysfunctional metabolism, carbs will make you fat.
The idea that Dave is propositioning here, I actually fully agree with, in the sense that it's not that carbohydrates are inherently the problem. The people are not tolerating carbohydrates to some extent because they are having metabolic issues. Using carbohydrates effectively and structuring the diet appropriately and minimizing things like polyunsaturated fatty acids is a better, less stressful strategy that optimizes metabolism more so than pushing for ketosis, which is stressful on the body and also drives problems with the production of ROS, which Dave will talk about when he talks about polyunsaturated fatty acids. I think setting up a reasonable diet that incorporates carbohydrates and minimizes these problematic components, doesn't drive stress, doesn't drive fatty acid oxidation, is a key process in actually moving towards metabolic health. And I see this with clients that I work with on a regular basis, and this is also borne out in research papers when you start to look at the actual metabolic state of obesity and diabetes and heart disease, where you're actually seeing an increase in fatty acid oxidation in these states and an impaired carbohydrate oxidation state. Now, how you go about fixing that is not necessarily going on a zero-carb diet. Even though it improves some markers, there's problems in the long term, and this is, for example, why someone like Thomas DeLauer is saying, hey, my fasting morning blood glucose is actually elevated above reference range. And it's like, yes, because he's upregulating gluconeogenesis and glucagon production at the liver because he doesn't have any carbohydrate intake, and glucagon is essential to driving insulin resistance. There hasn't been much talk around the actual stress hormones. There's lip service to stress, but they don't talk specifically about the direct effect of these stress hormones like glucagon, like cortisol, like adrenaline, like growth hormone on a consistent basis yet. And that'll be the next step in their transition into full-blown Peatarians. So let's get into the next clip. All right, so in this clip, we're going to hear Dave Asprey talk about omega-6 fats and their effects on the membrane, with Thomas DeLauer asking him some specific questions about that.
What are some of these reasons that omega-6s are problematic outside of just the old discussion about, oh, they're pro-inflammatory? I mean, let's get a little bit more granular than that.
They inhibit your cell membranes from being able to express receptors very well. So if you want to express an insulin receptor through your cell membrane, it'd be nice if it worked, but they make the membranes less functional, which is a primary issue with them. And along the way, they create reactive oxygen species that just keep being created over and over and over. That's the exterior cell membrane. In the mitochondrial membrane, which is where energy, heat, and a lot of manufacturing in the body happens, including things like melatonin and sex hormones, are mitochondrial.
To be fair, the low-carb community has talked about the problems with seed oils for a period of time now. However, what I would say is Dr. Peat was one of the earliest people to discuss the problems with seed oils and omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. And the mechanisms that Dave is talking about here are actually reality, where incorporating large amounts of polyunsaturated fatty acids in the form of omega-6s into the membrane actually causes a variety of problems because it destabilizes membrane function, and it also makes the membranes very susceptible to oxidative stress, where essentially the fats in the membrane, the building blocks of the membrane, these bricks are kind of really poor quality bricks. And if you heat them up too much or you expose them to any type of stressor, it actually really damages the bricks, and then basically the membrane becomes destroyed and then you lose function. So we don't want to be prioritizing fatty acid oxidation if we're loaded up on these polyunsaturated fatty acids. We also want to keep the polyunsaturated fatty acids, the omega-6s, low in general in the diet. And in the Western sphere, a large proportion of metabolic issues, I think, can be traced back to an increased consumption of highly processed foods involving rancid and oxidized polyunsaturated fats, particularly a high quantity of omega-6 fats. So in this next clip here, we're going to dive into omega-3s, which this is going to be a huge transitional point considering the previous recommendations in this sphere of taking high-dose omega-3s, which Dave actually mentions that he did, and he found that it was problematic.
I used to be an omega-3 fetishist, and I think Rhonda Patrick is going to evolve her perspective on that. There was a time, going back, even right when I was starting the biohacking movement, where I'm like, oh yeah, high-quality fish oil will do 3 glugs. And you look at what excess omega-3s do, they also oxidize. And even if you look at Ray Peat's work, who's not all of his work is correct by a long shot, but he's got some very interesting perspectives on that. Too much EPA and even DHA will oxidize and will drive systemic inflammation. So we have a classical case of if something is good, more is better. And I went down that path. Rhonda's still on that path. And she is going to realize that, yes, if you have an excess of omega-6, having an excess of omega-3 is better than just an excess of omega-6. But dropping dropping omega-6 and dropping omega-3 together and still having adequate DHA and EPA around maybe 2 to 4 grams a day for most people is the upper limit, that's going to create the best inflammatory profile. And you might, say after a head injury or something, you might do excessive EPA DHA for a week or two, but chronic elevated consumption of EPA and DHA omega-3 fats is not good for you when you take too much, coming from a guy who has taken too much.
Okay, so this is actually a bit of a transition from the previous perspective inside this low carb sphere. And even, Dave does make nod to this, to be fair, where high amounts of omega-3s, like if some omega-3 is good, then more must be better. This is something that Dr. Peat has directly talked about as being problematic, is a large consumption of omega-3 fatty acids. And this is something that Jay and I have talked about ad nauseum and at length on the Energy Balance podcast, where we basically discuss that high amounts of omega-3s drive lipid peroxidation inside the body and deplete antioxidant compounds like vitamin E, vitamin C, and also can cause issues inside the mitochondria. And some of their mechanisms where they're finding benefit in terms of anti-inflammation may be more so of an immunosuppressive effect. So, this transition, I think overall is good, where you're starting to see more people shift in this direction, understand, hey, maybe we shouldn't be taking tons of rancid fish oil. And something that's actually hilarious to watch is this idea that let's just keep total polyunsaturated fatty acids low, both omega-6 and omega-3 consumption, so that we don't have to take massive doses of omega-3s to balance out this excessive omega-6 profile that causes an inflammatory profile through the eicosanoids. Let's just keep both of them low overall. And I mean, that's the strategy that Dr. Peat had discussed. That's the strategy that Jay and I have discussed. And again, we pulled our information. We read Dr. Peat's work when we were in the low carb sphere and like, wow, this guy is like really onto something. And we started reading the research afterwards and seeing like, oh, wow, there's actually some merit here. There's actually some really interesting studies talking about these problems with the omega-3 fatty acids. It would just be nice here to see like, I guess there was a nod here, to Dr. Peat. To be fair, there was a nod, but more like, there's a mention like, oh, not all the things that he said was correct. And it's like this idea that we want to have more carbohydrates not running ketosis, this idea that we don't want to have a high amount of seed oils, this idea that too much omega-3 is problematic. And then we'll get into fasting and amino acid ratios. These are all ideas coming from Dr. Peat's work. All right, let's get into this next clip. And what we're going to discuss is the oxidation of polyunsaturated fatty acids. And this is actually something that I think Thomas DeLauer asks Dave Asprey. So let's jump in.
In your perspective, it's much more about limiting the oxidation than it is the pro or anti-inflammatory effect. That supersedes that, in your opinion?
It's not that you want to limit oxidation. If you limit oxidation, you suck at burning food. That's how the body works, right? And oxidation is going to make either heat or electricity. And then you're going to use the electricity to make other stuff in the body, right? So what you want to do is you want to limit reactive oxygen species that didn't come from making electricity or heat. And omega-3s in appropriate doses will do that. In higher doses, they actually make it worse. So I worry because I did this, 10 grams of EPA DHA a day. Do that for a while, and you'll see like a sallow face, like sagging skin. It's not a great outcome. And I think we're going to find over the next 3 years, we're going to find people realizing there's an optimal dose for omega-3s, and it's not high.
So the first thing is Thomas DeLauer is talking about, or what he's asking Dave Asprey about, is we actually want to limit oxidation. What I think he meant to ask Dave Asprey is, does he want to limit lipid peroxidation, which is different than oxidation? So the process of oxidation, as Dave points out, is the actual production of energy from food, this conversion of fats and carbohydrates to ATP, where the electrons are actually essentially moved towards oxygen as the final electron acceptor. Basically, this was a perspective that's been discussed in the bioenergetic sphere at length, where high amounts of polyunsaturated fatty acids drive lipid peroxidation from both omega-3s and omega-6. And in fact, omega-3s are worse in terms of lipid peroxidation. And so, Dave is saying now, like, oh, you want to have krill oil because it's phosphorylated, and the phosphorylation it somehow will limit the lipid peroxidation. But when you look at some of the studies on DHA and EPA, the lipid peroxidation is significantly higher. I think it was like 320 times higher than something like a saturated fatty acids like palmitic acid. So that's actually quite problematic. We don't really want to be driving high amounts of the DHA intake and EPA intake, even from some of the supplementation. Again, if you were going to even consider this, the requirements, I think, are exceptionally low. Again, I think this is great. I think sharing this information, people, and getting this out to the broader audience is an excellent thing. But this is something that these people in this sphere who had previously like vilified Ray Peat's ideas are now shifting towards this and saying, this is something new that I learned. It's like, this is something that Dr. Peat has said, for decades at this point about the omega-3s and the polyunsaturated fatty acids. Now, this next clip, what we're going to get into is we're going to get into fasting and this new perspective on fasting, new in quotations. This is also something that Dr. Peatarian was talking about as problems with fasting. So let me pull up this clip here.
Stimulation of a muscle is probably one of the best ways to, well, obviously you need to have protein in place too, but stimulating a muscle is probably the largest driver of being anti-catabolic, right? That's why I typically recommend, you and I are both fans of fasting. Fasting, like one of the most important things you can do is use your effing body, like lift. Use it. If you don't use it, you lose it. If you're quote unquote starving yourself and you're not lifting, then you're not doing something, then the body's going to see that as metabolically useless, right? So, so remind the body that it should use it. So is there something that's triggering the body to say, hey, hold on to this muscle while you're fasting? If it's, and it's not a loaded question. I mean, is there something that's reminding the body saying, hey, is it mTOR related at a local level? Is it something else? Is it flat out mechanical?
During a fast you're talking about? I mean, there's studies of how much muscle versus fat people lose on fasting, right? And people do lose meaningful muscle during a fast. I think the length of the fast depends on the person and it depends on the day.
Dave Asprey just specifically said that there is a meaningful loss of muscle during fasting. This is something that is essential to understand, and this is something that's heavily discussed inside the bioenergetic community, the problem with fasting in terms of upregulating stress hormones, downregulating thyroid, and downregulating anabolic hormones like testosterone or other sex steroids like estradiol and progesterone. This is actually heavily problematic to like say that fasting is good and you have all these negative effects. And this is why you see people like Dr. Peatarian recently coming out and saying, hey, I did fasting for 10 years and I actually lost lean mass. And they're looking, well, should there be some mechanism for preservation of lean tissue? And it's like, sure, perhaps there is, but in reality, people are actually losing pretty significant amounts of lean tissue from fasting, especially depending on how the fasts are done. And this is due driving the stress hormones. This last one here, where we talk about glycine and methionine, and this again, another one straight out of the bioenergetic playbook. So let's pull up that next clip.
I believe that the 1 gram of animal protein per pound of body weight is the diet that is going to give you the most longevity because it's going to keep you from losing muscle. It also is going to keep you from losing brain mass. But, and this is a big but, it only works if you're supplementing either collagen or glycine, because it's not the presence of methionine that's the issue. It's the ratio of methionine to glycine. And glycine is a beneficial amino acid. So if you take 15 grams of glycine a day on top of 1 gram per pound of body weight, you're going to have an optimal longevity situation. When you cut animal proteins out of the diet, you are automatically protein deficient because plant-based proteins simply don't work as well as animal protein.
Okay. So major point here is this idea of balancing the inflammatory amino acids, methionine and tryptophan, and specifically methionine, with adequate glycine intake. Again, there's like an old Ray Peat article where Dr. Peat mentions that an adult could probably get up to 30% of their protein intake from collagen, which is very high in glycine, and would help to minimize the inflammatory effect of methionine. And there's also papers that have been brought out talking about balancing glycine and methionine, and there's people like Chris Masterjohn, and then I think it was Alex Leaf, and people from Examine who had talked about this. I don't disagree with this perspective. This is something I actually do and balance with my clients, is balance the methionine to glycine ratio and hit the specific glycine target, that 0.2 grams per kilogram per day. This comes from a Spanish study, basically finding that the body's requirement for glycine is around that 0.2 grams per kilogram. And so I'm happy to see the transition. This isn't an ad hominem attack on Dave or Thomas. It's great to see them shifting their perspectives and learning as they go. But just interesting to be like, like maybe here, like there's some problems where I was thinking here, and then this is where I transition. I want to maybe see some components like that. And I think inside the comments and from the audience, you'd probably see a bit of less hate and people being less confused and being like, wait, I thought this was right, and now this is what's right. And because they're not actually seeing this transition. They don't get to see why Dave shifted over, because it's not a discussion of why he shifted over. It's kind of like, oh, I always thought this. And I think that's problematic for people and doing people a disservice overall. So that would be my piece here. This is a lot of bioenergetic stuff. This is a lot of stuff coming out of Ray Peat's work. I'm happy to see it gaining traction, but I'd wish that the transition would have been shown and exemplified more heavily inside these conversations.